Welcome all to this webinar titled Weapons in Latin America, Conflict, Crime, and Security. My name is Carlos Solar, and I'm the Senior Research Fellow in Latin American Security here at RUSI. Today, we have the chance to discuss the production, trade, transfer, and use of weapons and firearms in Latin America, and how this influences the dynamics of peace and conflict in the region. I'm joined by three distinguished speakers, Dr. Carlos Perez Ricard. Carlos is an assistant professor of international relations at the Centro de Investigación y Docencias Económicas, CIDE, in Mexico City. Hi, Carlos. I'm also joined by Dr. Diego Lopez da Silva, who is a senior researcher for the program on military expenditure and arms production at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, also known as SIPRI, in Sweden. Hi, Diego. I'm joined by Dr. Pilar Lizana, who is a researcher at Athena Lab, a defense and international security think tank based in Santiago, Chile. Hola, Pilar. To put the three presentations into context, we will be hearing from our in-house discussant, Genevieve Kotarska. Genevieve is a research analyst from the Organized Crime and Policing Research Group, also at RUSI. Carlos, Diego, Pilar, and Genevieve will be giving us insights from across the Americas on a series of topics, including how are markets for weapons and firearms playing a pivotal role in the political economy of urban and rural governance and territorial control within countries? What do we need to know about the fact that firearms are the most prominent mechanism of homicide in some countries, reaching above 80% of all reported cases? How do we understand the prevalence of organized crime groups linked to the proliferation of conventional and small arms? What are the consequences of major transnational organized crime groups sourcing weapons that once belonged to the national armed forces? And finally, two themes that interlink one another. First, what are the cross-national comparisons that need to be taken so that we can better scrutinize data, considering the rising number of weapons in the region, both at hands of the state and non-state actors? And second, what does it mean to have more meaningful transparency in weapons spending and arms acquisition, and what are the cascading effects on violence in urban and rural settings? To answer these and other pressing policy questions, each speaker will have 12 minutes for their initial presentations, followed by Genevieve's comments and a first round of questions back to the panelists. I will open the floor and take questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A box option at the bottom of the screen to raise your questions to me. I will be giving now the floor to Carlos Perez Ricard and his 12 minutes.
Thanks so much, Carlos. Do you hear me? Do you hear me well? Give me just a sec. Yeah. So I'm just thrilled, very happy to meet you all, Diego, Pilar, Carlos, Genevieve. I'm going to talk about Latin America and the relationship between crime, violence, and weapons. I'm speaking from Mexico City. I'm just super happy to be with you today. So my presentation has two main arguments, which I want to share with you. The first one, these are rather simple arguments. However, I do believe they are really relevant to discuss the relationship between crime, violence, and weapons. The first one is that it's impossible to understand current dynamics of crime and violence in Latin America without considering the proliferation of small arms in the region. The second one is that it's also impossible to analyze the Latin American setting, the Latin American experience with drugs, crime, and violence without understanding the relevance of the US arms market. So to understand Latin America's current relationship with crime and violence, we have to examine and to understand the relevance of the US arms market. I will go into these main arguments, and I hope you find this interesting. Let me start by showing you some pictures taken by a friend of mine who made some ethnography work in Mexico. I will refer mostly to Mexico. However, I will also try to expand the argument for the entire region. This is a picture from the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, taken 2 years ago or so. And you can see how heavily armed these criminal groups are. This is a cartel, a criminal group that does not only engage with drug trafficking, but also with extortion and other sort of crime. But here to see are the weapons and the sort of arsenal they have just to involve in criminal acts. So can you see the grenades, the weapons? These pictures are from some autodefensas, paramilitary groups in Michoacán. And you can see here again how heavily armed they are, right? The cars, and how they use all these weapons and all this stuff just to expand their criminal activity, right? So just the picture right here, just used to familiarize with the main argument that I want to proceed in today's presentation. Most of the insights, of the theoretical insights and the empirical insights of these presentations are based on this book, which I published and edited with 2 colleagues, with David Perez Esparza and Heidi Weigand just last year. The main objective of the book was to identify key trends on gun trafficking and gun violence across several regions, including Latin America. I was in charge of writing the book chapter on Latin America. And again, most of the insights and data comes from this book. So I encourage you to read the book or buy the book if you have a special interest in some of the things I will be talking about today. So just for general knowledge, I am sure that most of you are not familiar with the Latin American context. So let me just go briefly into a background to the security challenge in the region. Despite a decade or so of economic growth and the implementation of modest social programs, violence in Latin America has escalated to astonishing levels. The scale of the public security crisis is as never before. So just 4 different points about this. The first one, while only 8% of the planet's population lives in Latin America, 8% of the entire population, Latin America is the site of 33% of the world's homicides. So this is it's obviously that Latin America is one of the most violent regions in the world. As of 2019, Latin America accounted for 17 of the top 20 countries with the highest homicide rates per capita. And 19 out of 20 capital cities, the most violent capital cities in the world, are also in Latin America. So it's really amazing and astonishing the levels of crime in the region. According to victimization surveys based on 2020 data, 36% of all Latin Americans claim to have been victims of a crime. Impunity is really high across all sorts of crimes, not just robbery, but also homicide. And while the global average of firearms-related homicides is 32, the proportion of homicides involving firearms in Central America is 67, 53 in South America, and 51 in the Caribbean, way higher than in other areas of the world. So it's just to give you a brief setting of the current situation in Latin America on violence. Of course, I don't want to enter into details here, but there are many contributing factors for crime and violence in Latin America: high levels of social inequality, of course, structural factors, rapid growth of large cities and metropolitan areas, absence of very basic urban infrastructure, basic social services and community organizations in urban areas, weak and lack institutional capacity to control crime, and a very poor criminal justice system in Central America, Mexico, and many other countries in Latin America. However, and this is one of the main arguments for today's presentation, and I'm pretty sure that Pilar and Diego will touch on this in their presentations, the war on drugs and small arms availability play a very important role. They are very much probably the most relevant factors for explaining crime and violence in the region. So the argument is as follows: you might have the best criminal justice system in Mexico, you might have the best police in Mexico, but if you don't resolve these 2 very different issues, the war on drugs, and particularly for today's presentation, small arms availability, you can do whatever you want as a state, but you won't resolve the violence and security crisis in the region. Some very key data on the number of guns available in the region. At the end of 2017, Small Survey estimated that there were approximately 857 million civil held firearms in the world. Most of them are concentrated in four countries. These are Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, and Colombia. They led the list of the most heavily armed countries in Latin America. However, only a very small percentage, probably below 10% of these guns, are officially registered, are legal, are regulated. And this is despite the fact, and this is one of the paradoxes that I want to point out in today's presentation, that gun-related legislation in Latin America is very, very stringent, probably one of the most stringent gun-related legislation worldwide. In Latin America, while personal firearm ownership is permitted in every country, the legal process for acquiring a gun is more restrictive than in many other regions. For instance, in Mexico, you might find just one single place where you can buy legally a firearm, and this is Mexico City, and you need a lot of permissions in order to get one and to use it. And in most countries in the region, the carrying of firearms is prohibited throughout the national territory, except by public and private security offices. Of course, this is very different of what you see in the US, where arms and firearms are not regulated at all, or not regulated, or not as stringent as in Latin America. So the relevance of the US market for understanding crime and violence in Latin America. An important number of guns recovered in crime scenes in Latin America were either manufactured in the United States or were first imported to the United States and then illegally trafficked to Mexico. 70% of guns traced, this is ATF data, 70% of guns traced from crime scenes in Mexico originate in the US. Mostly they were bought in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, California. They were bought legally, but then they were trafficked illegally to Mexico. Of course, we don't have data about this, or at least good data about this, but most of the studies, very conservative studies, tell us that approximately 213 firearms are smuggled every year across the US-Mexico border, okay? This is about 600 firearms a day. So this is why I'm telling you that doesn't matter what you do in terms of public policy, in terms of police reform, in terms of improving your criminal system, when you have so many weapons coming to your countries, particularly Mexico, Central America, it's really difficult to do something against it. In fact, and this is one of the data that I consider amazing, American-made firearms are more likely to be used in homicides in Mexico than in the United States. And this is also true for Central America, okay? Let me just show you some data on Mexico, on gun violence in Mexico, and how it has risen in the last decade. The percentage of homicides in Mexico perpetrated with a gun in 2004 was just 25%. By 2020, I haven't updated this graph, which is from CAP, Center of American Progress, it's about 71%. So you can see here how it has increased a lot in the last 15 years or so. This is a graph taken by Eugenio Weigen, a co-author of mine, who shows a very strong association between homicides in Mexico and guns produced or imported in the United States. There's a lot of research to be done about this causal relation, right? But all studies I have read about this, and the stuff I have been written about this shows this very strong association between homicides in Mexico and guns produced or imported in the United States. So this is why I'm telling you it's probably not the only factor for explaining crime and violence in Mexico now, but surely one of the 3 or 4 main factors for explaining this. This is true not just for Mexico. We have plenty of research mainly by journalists, very little academic research, but very much by journalists, who shows that this is also the case for Guatemala. This can be the case also for Chile. I'm pretty sure Pilar will work and talk about this, for Colombia, for Brazil, and for most of the region. So there are some policy recommendations for the US. They should acknowledge this as a shared problem. If the US government tells us the entire time that it's about fentanyl and it's about the opioid crisis, Mexico is saying, okay, but the crisis, you should put also the problem of weapons and firearms into the entire puzzle. We need in the US institutional, we need to institute universal background checks for gun purchases and improve regulations in gun shows and a lot of stuff on policy recommendations for this. Let me just come back to the region, to Latin America and to Mexico. I think I just have 5-6 minutes more, Carlos. So just to go through what I consider the key security challenge in the region, just now about Latin America, no more about the US. We identified in the book and in the chapter on Latin America 3 main security challenges. The first one is gun trafficking due to institutional corruption in most of the region, smuggling of small quantities of guns, their parts and components, and the third one is the possession of illegal guns by non-state actors. So let me go through these 3 security challenges in the region and talk about the lessons learned in the last 10 years or so about these 3 main security challenges. So first, gun trafficking due to institutional corruption. Throughout the region, security officials are implicated in arms trafficking networks. So we shouldn't see gun trafficking just as a criminal activity that involves illegal actors or non-state actors. Gun trafficking is at the center of the state in many countries in Latin America, mostly in Central America and Mexico. So the network, the criminal networks involve state actors as well as non-state actors. In Guatemala, for instance, networks of former generals and high-ranking intelligence officers with strong ties to the political system have monopolized the smuggling of arms in the country. They are at the center of the state. Cases of guns that were initially bought through legal channels, but which were destined for illegal organizations from the outset, have been well documented in Latin America, again, mainly by journalists. One specific gun-related challenge that results as a natural consequence of institutional capture is the problem of leakage of ammunition and guns from national stockpiles. We have mostly everyday cases of leakage of ammunition and guns from national stockpiles. The lesson learned in the last decades is that police and military authorities must continually update their inventories to avoid leakage of ammunition. They have to improve management practices and become more and more transparent. From Latin American experience, we know that gun surrender programs are successful, and that in countries where the surplus of small military arms is significant due to a decline in the size of armed forces, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and Peru, the destruction of surplus military arms is particularly recommended. And here international cooperation is key. The UN and the ONIREC have plenty of programs across the region that are very helpful for avoiding these issues. The second main security challenge for the region involves the smuggling of small quantities of guns, their parts and components. This is not just a problem of Mexico and the US border. Most of the guns that circulate in the region were previously imported on a small scale basis. Of course, the US plays a very relevant role, but not only. Many weapons, many firearms that were very relevant in the civil wars in Central America are still very much at play in the region. While an important percentage of guns are legally purchased in the United States and then illegally trafficked over the Mexican border by car, traffickers also use more complex mechanisms to smuggle arms to the Caribbean and South America. And here the ships and maritime shipping services are relevant and have been neglected from research in the region. Here the lesson learned is that efforts to size guns are not enough. this data might it's quite interesting. The average number of guns seized in Central America is around 16,000 per year in Central America, 16,000 per year. The number is so low that even if no more firearms were to enter the market, it would take 188 years to remove all the guns from the Central America streets of trade. So the problem is not just to size of all the weapons. We have to do something about the demand and to reduce the demand for these items. Even very successful policies in reducing the supply of guns will lead to an increase in the price, which leads to a new and creative effort to provide a supply. So finally, the possession of illegal guns by non-state actors we identified in the book. This is also one of the most relevant challenges for security in the region. Latin America, both historically and contemporarily, is a region where idealized notions of the Bavarian state's monopoly of legitimate violence over a designated territory have never been fully realized. I don't think I have to go deeper into this, but the state in many regions in Latin America is neither legitimate and does not have the monopoly of violence in many regions. We have guerrillas, military groups, self-defense groups, as well as private security companies. Here the lesson learned is that the presence of strong laws around gun possession is insufficient, is not enough in preventing the emergence of non-state armed groups, and that attempts to simply disarm such groups would likely be met with strong local resistance. Simply disarming these groups, even where it is possible, often does not resolve the underlying issues, nor eliminate the power structures and links to political and economic elites. And I'm about to finish, so let me just conclude. Regarding the public security companies, which are these very relevant emerging actor in the regions, the lessons learned are quite straightforward. National legislation most clearly set out conditions and limitations for public security companies' operations, including the use of force by their staff, defines minimal training requirements for this personnel, and includes small arms countermeasures with regulatory public security companies frameworks. So last slide, specific policy recommendations for weapons and firearms in the region. First, to move forward toward a strategy of effective marking, record keeping, and tracing policy for guns. This would include the creation and development of a transparent system of end user certificates or similar documentation. As we speak today, exporting countries in Latin America don't require a delivery verification certificate to confirm that guns have reached their intended end user and lack procedures for tracing arms. We call also for institutional arrangements that separate those bureaucracies in charge of the regulation of arms from those that use them. For instance, in Mexico, the military is the bureaucracy in charge of regulating arms and using them. We call for an arrangement under mixed control, civil military, with a clear system of checks and balances. Here, the recommendation is to establish national coordination agencies for public guidance, research, and the monitoring of efforts to prevent the illicit trade in small arms. And finally, as a region, Latin America as a region, we recommend and we call for the creation of diplomatic coalitions integrated by governments in the regions and non-state organizations with the aim of coordinating efforts and advocating mainly for strengthening arms regulation in the United States. Again, if we don't advocate and if we don't put our efforts for stronger arms regulations in the United States, all of what we do in our regions in terms of criminal justice system and police reform won't be enough. So I think I went more than my 12 minutes. Thanks so much, Carlos. I'm very much looking forward to hearing Diego and Pilar comments on this. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Carlos, for that interesting presentation. I'm sure it will spark many questions at the Q&A session. I think it's a good segue to introduce Diego and his take on military weapons and everything that CIPRI has so richly contributed to the debate over the last decade. So Diego, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, Carlos. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'm already learning a lot from Carlos' presentation, and now I'm looking forward to Pilar's and Genevieve's as well. So I guess my contribution to the discussion here is that I want to bring a different piece to the puzzle that we are putting together here. I guess everybody, we're going to present a perspective to it and a piece of the puzzle, and the one that I would like to present is an overview of trends in arms transfers and military expenditure in Latin America. And that basically doing what I think, one of the things that I think CIPRI does best, which is to provide and investigate the data. So I made a data visualization for us to explore the data together. But as a caveat, just one thing that I want to say at the beginning is that I'm going to be focusing on major conventional weapons here. So I guess that's the different piece of the puzzle that I want to introduce here. But yeah, hopefully we can exchange some views by the end of it. So to start with, maybe the first thing I want to show is a historic overview of the trends in arms imports in Latin America. And this is measuring TIV values, the trend indicator values, which is the unit of measurement that CIPRI uses to track international arms transfers. And the line graph is a 5-year moving average, and the bar chart is the deliveries actually that took place. And one thing that is really obvious from this very first figure here is the 2 waves of arm imports in Latin America. The first one is beginning of the 70s up until the late 80s, and the second one starting in the early 2000s. I want to focus more on the latest one in the early 2000s. But one thing that I want to show here is already that wave was very brief and is already showing signs of ending. So what I want to do is explore that wave a little bit more and try to understand why it has ended already. So that will be one of the things I want to highlight throughout my presentation. So the second thing that I want to show here that I think is important for us to know is how big is the Latin American, let's say, arms market. And compared to the world is very, very small. I mean, we can see here that is about 3.5% of the total arms imports that took place over the past decade. So I guess that puts into perspective, I guess, how much we are in a way importing and militarizing and really if there is any sort of idea of an arms buildup. I think this is important to show because if we go back here to the first figure, during this wave, for instance, the president of Costa Rica in 2006 has said that in 2006, of course, Latin America was witnessing an arms race. And I guess there was a very, perhaps he rushed into that conclusion, and later on, a more sober analysis showed that that was not really the case. But I guess sometimes arms imports, they can really cause alarm, but I guess putting things into perspective can be very useful for our conversation. But now if we focus on this blue slice of the pie, so to speak, we can see which countries are the biggest arms importers in Latin America. And we can see that Venezuela and Brazil, they account for 42% basically of the arms imports. That's followed by Mexico, Colombia, and Chile. And as you can see, most of them except Mexico, the big arm importers are in South America. And of course, in the case of Brazil, this really has to do with the size of the economy and the size of military spending, which is Brazil is the largest military spending in the region. But I guess throughout my presentation, I'm going to focus more and note a few things about Venezuela and Brazil because they are their largest arms importers. But okay, so established who are the largest arms importers, but are they importing from whom? Before I do this is kind of a snapshot of the decade, and these are the 2 biggest ones, Venezuela and Brazil, but this changes over time. So one thing that I thought could be useful was really perhaps to see over time who are the biggest importers. And here we can see really the 2 waves of arms imports. As we can see here, when we begin in the 60s, but really in the 70s, and this is the year when military dictatorships took over the region, we can see that arms imports, they really increased. But then as the redemocratization took place in the 90s, they fall back only to resume again in the early 2000s. And that's something that I also want to explain a bit better. But we can see here at the bottom that Venezuela is really really importing a lot during that 2000s, and nowadays not so much. And that's something that we can talk about later. Okay, so we've seen who are the biggest importers over time. And here, what I want to show is the matrix of relationships, of bilateral relationships between recipients and suppliers of arms in Latin America. And this is an important point because arms import dependence, it's a really important thing when it comes to understanding political alliances and also autonomy, right? When a country is dependent on imports of weapons from another country, there is, in a way, a relationship almost hierarchical in a way, because you're dependent not only on weapons, but also maintenance and all sorts of things. So what we can see here in this snapshot is really a snapshot also of the political ties that Latin American countries have with arms importers, because the arms trade is not only an economic exchange, but is also a political exchange. And here we can see those political ties that I'm talking about. Of course, these changes over time. So if I limit the period right up here to the early 50s, we can see that is really mostly the United States. We don't have many other arms exporters. These changes, of course, in the 1970s, when we have the proliferation of arms suppliers in the world. Many of them did not survive. There was only for a brief moment, but we can see that since then, we have more arms suppliers to Latin America, and we can see the diversification of that. But of course, we can see historically, if we account for the whole period, some very strong relationships between the Soviet Union, with Cuba, for instance, of course, and from Russia to Venezuela, that during that period imported about 30% of it. But of course, if we focus on more recent period, we see that it's bigger than that. It's 69%. And that's something that we're also going to have a look in a moment. If we move on, I think this is a bit crowded, I think, this visualization, but I guess it all puts all the pieces together, or what I'm trying to talk about. Here in this map, we have the main exporters, and for instance, the United States exported 25% basically of all arms imports of Latin America. This, of course, is from 1950 to 2021. This is the graph that we opened the discussion with, where we can see the two waves. And here are the armament types. We can see like the profile of those imports, and here the designation of the weapons. And one thing that I'd like to show here is, of course, the United States is the most important arms supplier, but not by a monopoly in a way. We can see that there are other important arms suppliers to Latin America here. And one of the reasons why Latin American arms importers, they kind of diversified their suppliers, is because sometimes the United States was not willing to export advanced weapons to Latin America. And that was the case, for instance, in the 1960s, when it refused to sell advanced aircraft to Latin America. And then that was the case when Peru turned to France, for instance, and bought the Mirage 5. And then it became the first Latin American country to acquire supersonic fighter aircraft. So that's an interesting thing, I guess, to highlight. Another thing that I'd like to highlight, of course, is Venezuela. Already also talking about this shift in suppliers, because the case of Venezuela is very interesting. Again, we see two waves of arms imports here in the 1970s, and then another one in the early 2000s, and again, kind of falling again. But we can see very distinct periods here. If we look, for instance, from 1950 to the mid of 1980s, we see that the arms imports are really mainly from the US and Italy, of course, from many other countries in Western Europe. But that, of course, changes a lot after Chavez, of course, when Chavez is also seeking to establish political ties with non-Western countries, when we see China, Iran, and of course, mostly Russia, that has provided really important equipment, for instance, Sukhoi and transport helicopters, multi-role helicopters as well. So that, I guess, here we can see that shift in the profile of arms exporters to Latin America. And of course, the other biggest arms importer, which is Brazil, which has, of course, also coming from the United States, most of its imports. And I guess here the two waves are not that clear, but mainly because of the high numbers. Of course, if you compare it to the other countries, this will be a bit higher. Moving on now, I want to again go back to this idea of the two waves of arms imports, and I want to try to explain why this is the case, that we're coming to an end of a second wave. Of course, Brazil still has some outstanding arms imports to be delivered, but still, I guess, as a region, I don't think we are seeing really the continuation of that wave. And one of the reasons why we have the ending of this wave is how military spending is in a way financed in Latin America. And this has to do with the political economic profiles of the countries. Here, if we look at Latin American military spending, this idea of two waves appear again here during the military dictatorships in the 70s. Then we have the 1990s when democracy returned, and then in the 2000s again you have military spending going up. But then in the mid 2010s you start to see signs of fatigue. So you have those two waves here quite clearly seen. And just to understand this a little better, more information, just to show that Brazil really is the largest military spender in the region. And of course, you have Colombia and Mexico as well as big spenders. Before, Peru was a big spender during the 70s, and nowadays not that much. This, of course, has to do with the change in political regime. But one thing that I was talking about this idea of an arms race related to the increases in military spending, I guess one way really to weaken that hypothesis is if we look to Latin America, to military spending as a share of GDP. We see here that in constant dollars, of course, this has increased, but as a share of GDP, or what we call the military burden, this has actually fallen, which means that the increase in military spending had to do with economic growth. And that economic growth had to do with the commodity boom of the 2000s. That is very much linked to the behavior of military spending and, of course, arms imports in the region. So here, if we look at military spending, and then, of course, if we discern, if we have each line as the countries, I guess we can zoom in a bit here. We can look, for instance, at Brazil and Venezuela, again, the biggest importers. And we see some interesting things here. I guess Brazil, it is the biggest arms importer, but the military spending, it has its ups and downs. It's very volatile. And you see that we have here in the 2000s, a period of amazing increases in military spending. But then when the commodity boom starts to lose momentum, you see that, of course, the Brazilian economy and military spending start to show the signs. Another case of this is Venezuela again. Venezuela is a very strange case for military spending. That's a case that we really struggle because they changed their exchange rates, and then the whole time series messes up with the whole time series. But if we go to 2014 or 16, when we still have a reasonable numbers for exchange rates, we can see that again the military spending is very volatile, and you have this big increase here after Chavez came to power, and of course that coincided with a boom in oil prices as well. And of course, as oil prices came down, the prices, military spending also came down, and that kind of explains one of the reasons why the arms imports in the region have been falling in the past few years. But this also tells us something about how defense in Latin America is planned and financed. Because one of the problems here, I guess, for the defense planning is that during those periods of resource availability, many of those countries, they have designed defense industrial policies and defense policies that, of course, are almost inherently long-term or at least mid-term into the future. But of course, that was based on a momentary availability of resources. And of course, when this shifted after the commodity boom, which has to do with the economic profile of those companies of those countries that are commodity exporters, when that came to an end, of course, all those plans that they had started to fall apart. We can see now in Brazil, of course, Brazil still, the president, Bolsonaro, the current president, still has a very good relationship with the military, a relationship that is almost patrimonialist. But the interesting thing there is that even though military spending didn't increase because of economic conditions, they took out money from arms imports, which again is already suffering. You know, all those plans that were made during the 2000s are not being funded in that sense. So I guess this tells us something about the wave-like behavior of the not only arms imports, but also of military spending in Latin America. I guess those are the points that I wanted to cover. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. And this is my email in case you want to maybe send me a question later on. So thank you very much. Back to you, Carlos.
Thank you, Diego. I think most of the participants, including myself, are very jealous of that tool that you just used. And I think one of the questions for later on is how we can access that and if it's open to the public. Thanks for that presentation. I think it gives a lot of compliment to what Carlos Perez was just mentioning about Mexico's stance of buying and selling from the key exporters of weapons, both in the Americas and from abroad. So now I have the honor to give Pilar the floor. Pilar, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you to all the people in RUSI for putting together this event and inviting me to such an important conversation as the one related to arms trafficking. I've been listening with a lot of enthusiasm the presentations of Carlos and Diego, and I will try to join to this puzzle, as Diego said, the perspective from Chile, what is going on in Chile and what is happening in the national situation regarding this issue that today is worrying us every day a little more, because we are observing some data that it's concerning. And as the title of this seminar suggests, the arms trafficking in Chile, as in Latin America, is driven by conflict, crime, and insecurity. These three concepts are increasingly present today in this country, in Chile, in my country, and they are changing the security scenario that we are looking now. And they are bringing some new trends into the security discussion of our authorities and our decision makers. So it's very important for us to talk about this. With this in mind, I must say that Chile is inserted in the continental arms trafficking through different flows that arrives from the north. For example, we have identified shipments from the United States detected in our ports in the north, in Iquique or in Antofagasta, that they are important ports for us, and also through flows in South America. We have identified connections with some cases in Paraguay and also with some cases in Argentina. We can study these flows by themselves, but we cannot explain them if we don't consider the advance of the Latin American organized crime through Chile. In America, we say that there are flows of drugs that moves from south to north, and another one of weapons that goes from north to south. And in that dynamic, Chile was inserted in the regional drug trafficking as a transit country, but now we have an additional condition. Also, we are a consumer, and we are starting to see the organized crime groups having their operations in the country. We're starting to see more violent crimes and more weapons. For years, Chile was away from the operations of these groups, like the Primer Comando de la Capital, for example, the Brazilians, or the Mexican cartels, Sinaloa and Jalisco Nueva Generación, and many other groups that are very well known in Latin America, that they push the homicide rates in the region, but they are coming now to Chile. They are arriving with force in the country, and also they're pushing our homicide rates too. As we see in the global report of armed trafficking of the United Nations presented in 2020, the report shows a relationship between armed trafficking and the action of this type of violent groups. It's not so different here in Chile. We also sees a lot of arms related to other crimes like drug trafficking. That is something also happening here. But this report states something that is important, and is important to us because the report says the higher the homicide rate and the drug seizure rate, the greater the weapon seizure. What are we seeing here in Chile today? We are seeing higher homicide rates, more violent crimes, and also we're seeing more weapon seizures. The report is even more accurate when it includes the homicide perpetrated with firearms. In that case, what is going on here and what is the data that we are observing is that the homicides at the national level has increased this year, 2022, by a 33.5% national level. If we go and zoom in some places, for example, in our regions in the north, we can see that that increase is 45%. But if we go to the national level and we see the data, we can see that 60% of all the homicides that are perpetrated in the country are perpetrated by a firearm. And from that 60%, 70% of them are due to tit for tat among rival criminal groups. As we say here in Chile, ajuste de cuentas. So we are observing an upward trend in this cause of death that is very worried, and we are observing obviously an upward trend in the use of firearms to perpetrate homicides. That is one of the main concerns here in the public security debate, but also we have to analyze this in the context of insecurity that is associated to violent crimes that are well known in other countries of Latin America, and that are consequences from the action of organized crime. Chile had remained on the sidelines of these activities for a long time, but for approximately 3 years ago, maybe 4, we are seeing with a lot of concern the accelerated advance of organized crime in the national territory. Today, we can say that at least 5 transnational organized crime groups have arrived to Chile. These are Cartel de Sinaloa, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, Cartel del Golfo, Tren de Aragua, Primer Comando de la Capital, Mexican, Colombian, Venezuelan, Brazilian groups. And now I remember that Carlos at the beginning of this webinar said that Brazil, Venezuela, Mexico, and Colombia concentrate the firearms in Latin America. But we not only have these cells of these groups operating here, they also came with new criminal techniques, and they are teaching new criminal techniques, obviously, to our local bands. And now we're seeing an increase in violent crimes and increase in the homicides pushed by the fighting between these groups for power. Additionally, to this criminal context, we have to include 2 more elements. One is the security issue that we have in 4 regions in the south of the country, the regions in the so-called southern macrozone, that it's a part of Chile formed by the regions of La Araucanía, Biobío, Los Ríos, and Los Lagos. Since 1990s, we have security problems associated with indigenous communities that they declare themselves in conflict with the state, and they use terrorist techniques to materialize the territorial control and to try to push away the state from that area. Around this conflict in the south and the security issue in the south, we also find drug trafficking, we find mafias dedicated to illegal economy, and we also find armed trafficking. We even can draw a line of armed trafficking from the ocean to the mountain, and we can follow that line all over to Argentina. Just to have an idea of what we are living in the South with this rural violence, on the month of October, just last October, we count 26 attacks only related to this political cause of these groups that declare themselves in conflict with the state. So we have two elements that are pushing the armed trafficking here in Chile and the illegal market of arms. But also with this too, we have to also consider the development of illegal economies that we are having around our productive sectors, that they are based on the theft of copper, wood, and fish. By whom? By organized armed groups, heavily armed, that are increasing the perception of insecurity in our population. So with all of these elements, we can build a panorama, a scenario, security scenario in Chile based on conflict, crime, and insecurity as the title of this seminar. And considering that, we have to look now the data that we have regarding armed seizures here in Chile and what's going on with them in the last year. For example, on 2022, our civilian police informs us of an increase of 11.2% in the seizure of weapons. They found that the modified blank weapons are the ones that increased the most, reaching a 44.1% of increase in the periods going through January to May 2021 and January to May 2022. The question that we need to ask now is, where do the weapons come from? They come from inside the country. We're having national illegal production. We are receiving them from another part of the continent. And to answer that, the answer needs a little bit of those points of view that I just tell you. Because first, we have identified shipments from United States enter mainly through the north. We have identified and intercept shipments in Argentina. We identified links between Chile and Paraguay and a possible route of arms trafficking related to organized crime that operates there. But that's not enough, because as we can see, the modified blank weapons are the ones that are increasingly the most. So we need to dig a little bit more and see what's going on in the national scenario. And there we can find figureheads for purchase in the conventional market. Some people pay to another one just to buy the gun in the conventional market. We identify artisanal production, diversion of duly registered weapons to third parties, etc. So we're, to answer this question of where do the weapons come from, we're seeing that Chile, first, as I said at the beginning, is inserted in the flows of the armed trafficking in the region, but also have some illegal market inside. To make to try to use an example that of something that is going on here that maybe in other countries of Latin America is more developed, but here in Chile we're seeing that it's starting development with strength and it's worrying us, is the narco culture that maybe we can see in other countries. And here we start seeing gangs that like to show their firepower, their weapons in social media, pictures, videos, just to present to the state and to rival bands and to show how much power they have. So for us, we're seeing an important trend around crime, conflict, and insecurity regarding to organized crime groups that are arriving to Chile, related to more violent. And we can say that arms trafficking here in Chile has to do with these three concepts that marks the name of this webinar, that is conflict, crime, and insecurity. As these conflict concepts say, they're they're drawing a security scenario that is, for us, is very different than one we had a decade ago. From the 2000 to until now, the security scenario in Chile changed. The challenges for the state are very different. And those challenges are coming from conflict, crime, and insecurity. The state has to face them with responses, but that responses cannot come only from an effort of one state. We're inserting a region, as Carlos said, that has the 8% of the population, but the 33% of the homicides. We're inserted in a very violent region with very important or criminal groups that are heavily armed, that are challenging our states and our region and our continent every day. So we need an effort from the state, we need an effort from our decision makers, but also we need an effort that coordinates all of us to face these challenges that maybe for Chile are a little bit new, but for other countries in the region, not so much. With that, I think I'm okay in the time, Carlos. I hope I used my 12 minutes. Thank you all. Thank you very much. I'm waiting for your questions.
Thank you, Pilar. That was a great contrast to the Mexico case that Carlos has just mentioned, but of course with very similar trends and worrying for Chile to hear the numbers. Now, who has the difficult task of, again, putting all the puzzle together is my colleague Genevieve. So go ahead, Genevieve.
Thanks, Carlos. Yeah, no pressure for me now after some really great presentations from our three speakers. And thank you to all of them for their important and thought-provoking ideas. I think you've raised some really interesting points about the scale of the problem that we're facing in Latin America and also the inadequacy of current responses. I'm currently working on a threat assessment of cocaine trafficking in the Caribbean. And one thing that's really clear to me from the project so far is that cocaine trafficking is inextricably linked to issues like arms trafficking, human trafficking, money laundering, and that we shouldn't be viewing these issues in isolation, but should be trying to tackle them holistically. For example, there's been increased arms seizures in Trinidad, and this is linked to the presence of Colombian and Nigerian criminal actors there. There's also the transfer of weapons from security actors to illicit actors, as we've discussed here today. And given the variability of these security threats, the illicit economies, the non-state armed groups, including cartels and those in political opposition to the state, I think we need to be thinking holistically and thinking slightly differently about how we're approaching this and moving away from the traditionally securitized approach that has been adopted in Latin America. And I think this is especially important given the changing patterns of violence at the moment. So as Pilar mentioned, we're seeing increased violence in Chile, but also in Ecuador and Paraguay. And this shows the spread of the sort of cartel modus operandi to other countries in the region. There's two threads in particular that I'd like to pull on that our speakers have touched on today. I'm going to try and keep it relatively brief, as I know we've got lots of interesting questions that have come in from the audience. Firstly, I wanted to discuss some of the other factors that are underlying the issues of violence and arms in the region. Carlos touched on these, but it's not just the prevalence of weapons that are driving violence at the moment. There's a whole host of other factors that need to be addressed. There's the issue of the weak or absent state in many countries, minimal public service provision, a lack of education and employment opportunities, corruption within government and security services, wide and various illicit economies. Now, this plays out differently in each country and between rural and urban areas, but ultimately one or more of these factors is impacting every single country in the region, and arms availability fans these flames that the underlying factors contribute to. And I'm not sure that curbing arms flows in Latin America by itself can address the violence that we're currently experiencing, because all these underlying factors need to be addressed as well. And so I think that really highlights the need, as I said, for a holistic approach, and one that addresses both the underlying causes and the symptom of violence. The other thread that I'd like to pull on a bit is the role of the US. And this has been across all three of our speakers today. The US is prevalent in the issue of arms in Latin America. There's the legal trade that Diego touched on, and there's been changing dynamics over the last few decades, as he mentioned, but the US remains a really big player in this area. From 2000 to 2017, the US provided 20 billion in security assistance to Latin America, and 17 billion of this came through programs as part of the war on drugs, so Plan Colombia and the Merida Initiative in Mexico. And such security assistance, it's not clear what impact it's had and whether it's actually been beneficial in the region, but it has been linked to corruption and human rights abuses, and several government and security figures that were backed by the US have since been linked to issues of violence and drug trafficking. And as has been mentioned, the illegal arms trade is also, the US is inextricably tied up in it. Mexico's recently launched a couple of lawsuits against US gun manufacturers, which highlights the fact that so many of these weapons are flowing from the US south into Mexico and then around Latin America, being trafficked throughout the region. And these trades are taking advantage of loopholes that laws are trying to address, but they're acting too slowly. So there's straw buyers. They ask people with clean criminal records, no criminal record, to buy weapons, which are then smuggled south. And there's loopholes permitting private sales of weapons in the US. And also, which was touched on briefly earlier, the issue of ghost guns, where dealers sell nearly complete frames or receivers, which can then be fully assembled later. And whether the loopholes, the laws to address these loopholes will be effective remains to be seen. But given the issues here and how prevalent the US is in these flows, one of the questions I'd like to ask our speakers today is whether gun violence in Latin America can be curbed without tighter gun regulations in the United States. I've got so many questions that I could ask given the great conversations we've had, but I know there's a lot of questions waiting to be asked from the audience. So the other question that I'd like to touch on is there's been lots in the news about the increasing economic and political role of China in the region. And I'd like to know if there's any evidence of their involvement in legal and illegal transfers of arms and the related issues that we've discussed today, and how significant this is in Latin America. But thank you again to all our speakers, and I've really enjoyed it so far.
Thank you, Genevieve. Conscious of time, what I think I'll do is I'll pick one question for each of the participants, and in this first round of answers, I think you can also include some of Genevieve comments within your answer. Please keep it shortly because I see more questions coming. So if we go in order of appearance, I have one question from Karina Solmirano, who asked, Carlos Perez, have you found any evidence in your research of the connections between DDR programs in Central America in the 90s and the current availability of small and light weapons in the region? Or is the current proliferation mainly due to the factors you identified earlier in your presentation? So that's for you, Carlos. Then if I jump to Diego, of course, Elena asked if those graphs are publicly available, but there are two more questions for you. One is about whether CIPRI takes into consideration donations such as China's to Bolivia's army. What about dual technologies? And then Karina Solmirano also had another question for you, Diego, which is arms procurement in South America during those years was mainly boosted by off-budget funding. How is the situation today? And Ewan Grant from London asked a very good question to Pilar. It's about in the north, ports and inland, I will suggest, are there any signs of strategic minerals being traded for arms? For example, stolen from legitimate mining, or does the narcotic trade make it unnecessary? So Carlos Perez, why don't you take a minute or a minute and a half to answer those questions, please?
Okay, just in 1 minute or a minute and a half. Thanks so much, Karina, for your question. Indeed, disarmament, the mobilization and reintegration programs in Central America were quite successful, but still that doesn't say anything about plenty of weapons that are still available from civil conflicts in the region until today. I have done some ethnographic work and I've been traveling to that area in the last years. and I'm aware of the availability of those weapons still today. So it's not just about U.S.-Mexico gun trafficking dimension, but also, of course, about the stock of firearms that stay in the region since the 1980s till today. I just want to address briefly Genevieve's comments, which I found extremely interesting. I agree completely with you. It's not impossible. It's not possible to see this problem disentangled from the drug issue. Obviously, I was just talking today about the firearm stock, but I don't think we can disentangle both cocaine trafficking and psychoactive trafficking with the arms issue. Both stuff are really connected. So with you, I completely agree in the holistic approach. However, on the underlying dynamics of crime and violence, I agree again. Lack of state presence, infrastructure, poor governance, poor criminal justice. The underlying factors are there, and they have been there for years, for decades. However, for Mexico, for instance, what you see from 1950 to 2006 is a decline of violence for 60 years on homicide rates. We have done this historical chart in which we show how violence dynamics, mainly homicide dynamics, have declined for 50 years with the same structural and underlying dynamics, right? But from 2006 onwards, they start to increase again. And this is obviously to show the causal relation is always difficult, but has to do with the assault weapon ban in the US that finished in 2004, and with the astonishing increase in the production of firearms in the US. Cocaine was weak, absence of state was there, everything was there and still here, but the only factor that changed, yeah, is the astonishing production of weapons in the United States. So I agree, we have to understand all the contributing factors, but the only thing that changed in 2006, 2007, 2004 onwards till our days is the dynamics in the U.S. arms market. So this is why I'm saying here that as one of the main arguments is that nothing will change, and I'm quite pessimistic here. Nothing will change until we do something about this in the U.S. And this is not just a thing from the federal government, but has mainly to do with local decisions taken in Arizona, taken in not in California, but in Arizona, in New Mexico, and Texas, where it's easier to buy a assault weapon than to buy a cigarette when you are 19 or 20 years old, or to buy a beer, but you can buy a weapon. So this is completely mad, and nothing will change in our country until this is changed in the US. And it's also a very good example of the transnational dynamics of crime and violence. Something that happens in the US has extremely and extreme consequences down to the border here in Mexico. So thanks so much, Genevieve, for the comments, and I hope I answered the comments from Karina as well. Thanks so much, and Pilar and Diego, I love your presentations, and I'm looking forward to stay in contact with you. Thanks so much for them.
Diego, would you like to go next, please?
Sure. Thank you very much for the questions. So about the graphs, I can make them available. I mean, right now they're not, but the data is available. You can go to SUPI's website and download the arms trade database, the military expenditure database as well. But the workbook, as we say, for Tableau, it's not available, but I can make it available. Maybe I can share that with Carlos, and then maybe, I don't know, someone tweets, or I'm not quite sure how to share that, but I can take care of that for sure. First question about donations. Yes, we do include those, and also if you go to SUPI's website and download the trade registers for the arms transfers, you'll see that we have for some transfers, we have notes, and sometimes we do note that those are donations. Sometimes if it's secondhand and modernized or new equipment. So you can also find that information there, but we also consider that. Just about the first question about China, Yes, China is becoming, it's not really an important yet exporter. It is mostly to Venezuela, which to Venezuela for the past decade, it's a considerable amount, but for the other countries is really small. So going back to the second question, which is about donations, we do include those for Bolivia. For Venezuela, it's mostly aircraft and armored vehicles that have been exported. About dual use, there is a program here at CIPRI, which is just for dual use ammunitions. For us, is a tricky thing for the program, at least, that does arms transfers, because sometimes the threshold about military use and not is quite complicated. So sometimes we have to do a case-by-case thing, but that's something that we're really concerned, and CIPRI as a whole, of course, having a program just about that. About off-budget spending, I better get this right, because Karina wrote an excellent paper about it, about transparency in military spending and arms acquisitions, so which was really, really good. I used it a lot in my master's dissertation, so I better get this one right. So yes, indeed, she's right about it. And the current state is that we have some improvements and we have some cases getting worse. The main so just to clarify what is off-budget funding at that point, is when funding for the military comes from outside, either outside the state budget or outside the budget of the Ministry of Defense. There is some definitions about what is extra budgetary and what is off budgetary, but mostly it will be outside the Ministry of Defense. So what can be an off-budget mechanism? For instance, Chile, I guess, is the main example, and that's also the main case of improvement. So Chile in 1958 or 48, I couldn't quite remember, they created this mechanism that was later changed in the 70s during under Pinochet, that allocated 10% of copper export revenues to military spending. So it went to a fund for arms acquisitions and maintenance, and what was straight from copper revenue. So the budget, Congress, for instance, and of course during the dictatorship it wouldn't, but even after democratization, and Congress could not vote and had no control over that part of the budget. And in 2019, in the early 2020, Chile got rid of that legislation and put in place a new one, where now Congress has control and oversight of a new fund for, it's called a strategic fund, one of those. There are two, and now Congress has control over it. So that was a massive democratic improvement and civilian control over the budgetary mechanisms of the military. So that was a big win. But of course, it took many years to take place. And one really good example of why this is an improvement is that in 2020, Congress voted to reallocate money that was originally intended to the modernization of the F-16s to the COVID pandemic relief. So there you can see how more democratic control over the budget, it really translates into reallocating resources more in line with society's needs. So that is a really good example. Other cases such as Venezuela, which has the Fonden, and part of it, a big part of it, goes to the military, goes straight from oil rents to the military, and is a big part of it. Continues the same. We don't have data. Data for Venezuela is getting worse and worse. For Peru established in 2005 a mechanism that takes revenues from natural gas exports to the military as well, but remains the same. Now, the case that is getting worse is Brazil. So Brazil, in the latest national defense strategy, added a line or a strategic directive to establish a 2% guideline for military spending, in a way emulating what NATO has. It's still unclear if this will be a fixed amount that every year, regardless of what Congress thinks about it, will be allocated to the military or not. But still, it's not a good sign. We don't know if this is a guideline or if this is really something that is fixed. And if it is something that is fixed, is a major democratic, backslide in a way. We're losing control over the budget in a way, Congress. So that will be, I guess, the state of affairs when it comes to off-budget military spending. So thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Diego. Pilar, please go ahead.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you for the question. It's a very interesting question. It's not easy to answer because to understand what's going on in the north border of Chile, we need to consider all this context that Carlos present us about the transnational organized crime and how the criminal activities interact in our north area. There we can see drug trafficking, armed trafficking, human trafficking and smuggling, and although we can see them separately and together. So we have a really challenging security scenario in the north. And to that, we have to add the illegal economies around the metal, the copper mainly, that we are seeing strongly in that area with armed groups that are part of a bigger organization that is dedicated to this illegal market. They steal the copper from the train or the mines or from the cables in the cities, but they are one part of this illegal economy. They are part of a bigger organization that they sell that copper that is stolen to another company that has to laundry the copper. They use different financial instruments to do that. And we do have evidence about violence and firearms used to perpetrate the robberies. But in our research, Athena Love developed a research around the copper illegal economy. We didn't find a link or a trade between strategic metals or arms. So we cannot say that that is going on, but we can say that these groups need to supply arms from somewhere. And one of the areas maybe they can find supplies in arms are these modified weapons or these flows of armed trafficking that are coming to Chile through our north ports. We identify some shipments of pieces of guns and arms coming from the United States. We're not sure if the United States was the main location where they started, but we are sure that they came from the States. So no, we haven't got evidence to say that we have trade between strategic metal and arms, but yes, we know that these are violent groups that use arms and supplies in the illegal market.
Thank you, Pilar. I would like to jump in with one question for all of you, basically, including Genevieve. I think you, Genevieve, picked up on the issue of how guns availability is also correlating with larger armies. So I think this is the point where actually all three speakers kind of like overlap, right? Diego showed this presentation about Latin American countries spending more from the 2000s onwards. Now there seems to be some sort of fiscal austerity, which might correlate with more transparency and more accountability for states to buy their weapons and so on. But if we look at recent purchases by both the police in different countries, they want to become new armies, right? So they buy these mini tanks, they get all this armor and so on. So they want to look like the police, like the military, basically. And then on the other hand, we also have the military, which is performing on policing missions and duties and roles. So I think there is an interplay of different authorities, all trying to heavily militarize and arm themselves without taking into consideration that this is more, and it will become more and more violent as soon as all these state and non-state groups are confronted by different daily routines, such as policing. So Carlos, why don't you go ahead with your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Carlos. Here, I think that the elephant in the room in the discussion and the point that interlinks the three presentations is the point of the militarization of security in Latin America, where the army is actually taking tasks of security And there's plenty of research to be done about the sort of weapons that they are using historically compared to what they used to use 20 or 30 years ago, and the sort of weapons that they are using today, and the regulations that they have to have. So yeah, I agree completely. The elephant in the room in the discussion, and the main debate in Latin America is about the militarization of security processes and the weapons that the police is actually using. Yeah, completely agree, Carlos.
Diego, any thoughts?
Yes, I just want to say that yes, we do follow those developments of the police being more militarized and sometimes the military doing police functions. And I can give you even the operations to fight crime. That's something that drives the arms trade as well in Latin America, mostly in Central America, of course, and Mexico as well. Mexico, beginning in 2006, began to really import weapons for police operations and using the military in those operations. But nowadays, for instance, with the creation, I think it was in 2019, of the Guardia Nacional, and we do count part of the budget of the Guardia Nacional as military spending because it's a very highly militarized body, right? The huge part of it, most part of the personnel come from the military. The whole structure is like this. And we also count for other countries as well, such as France, with the gendarmerie as well. So that's something that drives, you know, the whole insecurity that we're talking about. It's something that drives both military spending and the arms trade as well. El Salvador, the same.
Just Diego,
yes.
A brief update on this. 2 months ago, a new law passed, and now the Guardia Nacional is actually formally part of the military. So it's not anymore de facto, but it's currently a part of the military. So now you have good reasons to take this into account.
Oh, good to know. Thank you very much. Yeah, exactly. So that just reinforces the point that that this is really a thing. Like in Brazil, I don't think that this is really driving the arms imports. But in Brazil, the trend of what we call the law and order operations and the use of the military in Rio de Janeiro, we had a massive intervention that took almost I think a year of the military really occupying the state in that sense. And I guess this is a bit out of my turf, but I guess this also says something about the current state capability to deal with these things. Because in Brazil, for you to have a law and order operation in your state, the governor has to send a document to the executive, the federal executive, saying that the state functions of that state to police. And one article of the Constitution that talks about public safety and order, it's not functioning anymore in that state. So you have in a way to declare that you're not able to really hold, as Carlos was saying, the monopoly of violence in that state. So that says a lot about current trends and how the state can deal with these things. But mostly in Central America, that's a really big driver of both military spending and arms trade. Yeah.
Pilar, please go ahead.
Thank you, Carlos. This conversation is going on right now here in Chile. Our congressmen are discussing about that. The government is proposing new tools and new arms for the police. And that may be a consequence of the new crime scenario, the fear that the population is feeling right now because of these new violent crimes. But I think that before, at least in the phase that we are in Chile, that it's really different from maybe the Mexican context, we need to ask before saying which tool or which arm we will use or we will give the police. Maybe we need to talk about our security architecture, our security strategy to face these new challenges. And in order to that, we can answer if we will give more arms or less arms, or if we will use an exception, a constitutional exception, for example, in the South to face this conflict that we are having with these communities that says they are in conflict with the state. We are using now a constitutional exception and we have military in that area. But the new challenges are so big and so different from the ones that we had before that I think that, yes, we can discuss about it, but we need to start discussing about our new security architecture and our new approach to these challenges. And we have to learn a lot from all the countries in the continent, from Canada to Argentina. We have to cooperate, and we have to respond from our own context also, because maybe we can have cells of organized crimes here, but they are operating in a context that is very different from the Brazilian or Colombian or Venezuela.
Thank you, Pilar. And Genevieve, I think you might come in with countries that we haven't touched that much from your research at RUSI, no?
Well, it's not something we've looked into particularly because the cocaine threat assessment is a relatively new project. But I think the issue that's key for me is that this is an escalatory cycle. So Carlos showed the photos of very highly militarized cartels in Mexico. A police force like you have in the UK would be completely impotent in the face of cartels that are armed to that level, right? So then the military are the only ones who are able to respond. The police militarize so that they can be part of the response. And then you have a highly militarized police that is responding to civilian issues. And that's when you have the problems that we've seen in countries like Chile and Colombia with police violence against protesters, because they are not trained to respond to these issues. They're trained to respond to non-state armed groups. And so I think it just creates this cycle of violence, and there's not really any actor that can step down within that context, because there's always going to be someone else who is better armed. So I see no obvious route out of this situation, but I also think that continuing to advance the militarization of state security services is not helping.
Yeah, Carlos Perez, finally, please.
Very quickly, I think that this comment leads us to a final reflection on this, on the importance of demilitarizing, if you accept how I use the word, to demilitarize organized crime. And this is where the small arms regulation agenda and the security agenda intersect very well. In order to demilitarize public security in Mexico, which we need to do if we want to protect our democracy, and if we want to stay in a sort of democratic government environment and this sort of stuff. If we want to demilitarize security, our security apparatus fast, and more importantly, we have to demilitarize organized crime by prohibiting the US citizens and Mexican citizens to traffic arms into Mexico. And this is the moment, or at least the point, where I think that both agendas intersect very well: arms regulation and public security. And this is really paramount in Mexico, and probably the most important task for the next president in Mexico to do something about this with the US government at the local level, but also at the federal level, to resolve this issue and this problem.
Thank you, Carlos. I think I'm gonna bring this webinar to a close on this high note. I think it's been a very interesting conversation in which we provide some answers, but also open up new avenues, especially because we put together a mix of researchers looking at different angles of the weapons and in Latin America debate. And I think it was very useful to look at two country realities, and of course the data that Diego finally interpreted for us from RUSI, from CIPRI. I'm sorry, it was so interesting. There's one final question about the US military industrial complex, which I don't think we have the time to answer, but I will definitely invite all of those attendees to the webinar to look up at RUSI, CIPRI, of course, and Athena Lab and the CIDES research on this. I think you three, you four with Genevieve are doing excellent research. And of course, thank you, Pilar, Diego, Carlos, and Genevieve for what has been a very interesting webinar. I think we all had fun, and as I've mentioned in the chat, I think this will be up on the web later during the week. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos.
Thank
Had a
you
lot of
very
fun.
much,
Thank you.
Carlos. Thank you.
Thanks so
Thank you,
much.
Pilar. Thank you,
Thanks so much.
Carlos.